On the night of March 14th, 1978, 17 people walked into a London Underground carriage at King's Cross Station, and exactly 4 minutes later, they were gone without a trace. No bodies, no evidence of struggle, no CCTV, no records, just empty seats and a mystery that Scotland Yard would spend decades trying to bury. If you're watching this for the first time, subscribe to the channel and join us. But let's go back to where it all began. It was 11:47 p.m. on the District Line. The train pulled into King's Cross Station on a wet Tuesday evening, the kind of London night where the fog clung to the platform like a living thing and the fluorescent lights hummed a monotonous, almost hypnotic drone. The carriage was unusually full for that hour. Commuters, night shift workers, a few late-night travelers heading toward the East End. Among them was Marcus Webb, a 34-year-old accountant who'd been working late at his firm in the city. He remembered that night with painful clarity even decades later. The way the doors hissed open, the way everyone shuffled in without really looking at each other, the unspoken agreement of London commuters not to acknowledge one another's existence. There was nothing remarkable about that moment, nothing that suggested anything was about to change. The carriage doors closed. The train lurched forward into the tunnel with a rhythmic metallic groan. What happened next was never officially documented. The train was scheduled to stop at St. Paul's next. It was a 6-minute journey under normal circumstances. But somewhere between King's Cross and St. Paul's, in the darkness of that tunnel beneath the city streets, something broke the ordinary rhythm of the London Underground. Witnesses would later claim they heard a sound, not a mechanical failure, but something else, a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the entire carriage. One passenger, a woman named Judith Cairns who was on the train with her young daughter, would describe it years later as a sound that made your teeth ache, like electricity made audible. The lights in the carriage flickered once, twice, then they steadied again. By the time the train pulled into St. Paul's Station, the carriage was nearly empty. 12 seats occupied. The same number of passengers. The doors opened. Passengers got off at their stops with no sense of urgency, no awareness that anything was wrong. The train continued its route. It wasn't until the 12:17 a.m. stop at Bank Station that someone pressed the alarm. A passenger on the southbound platform had been waiting for the District Line train when he noticed a carriage attendant standing motionless on the platform, staring at the train with an expression of genuine confusion. The attendant had been checking the carriage count, a routine procedure, when he realized that his written manifest didn't match the actual number of passengers. His log showed that 17 people should be on this train. The carriage had left King's Cross with 17 passengers, but now there were only 3. He radioed through to the control center. Within minutes, the train was pulled into a holding siding. Within an hour, every protocol the Underground had was activated. Doors were sealed. Investigators came down into the tunnels with flashlights and clipboards. They searched every inch of that carriage. They searched the tunnel between King's Cross and St. Paul's. They dredged the sections where the railway ran near the Thames, where a body might have been swept into water if someone had fallen through a gap in the platform. They found nothing. No bodies, no blood, no clothing, no identification papers or personal effects except for the items left behind by the 3 passengers who had remained conscious enough to get off at St. Paul's. A handbag, a briefcase, a child's toy, items that proved people had been there, but offered no explanation as to where the others had gone. The police investigation was swift and, by necessity, quiet. 17 people don't simply disappear from a sealed metal carriage 40 feet underground. The implications were too disturbing to allow public panic. Within 48 hours, a narrative was established. A tragic accident. The records were muddled. There had been a miscounting. The investigation was closed. Official files were filed away. The 3 surviving passengers were questioned, offered compensation under strict confidentiality agreements, and asked never to speak of the incident again. Most complied. But one man never stopped thinking about that night. One man carried a memory like a weight that never got lighter. His name was Thomas Ashford, and he was 22 years old when he stepped onto that carriage on March 14, 1978. He was one of the 3 who survived. For 45 years, he kept quiet. He built a life. He married. He had children. He worked as a construction foreman in the outer boroughs of London, gradually building a reputation as a quiet, reliable man who never drank too much, never caused trouble, and never, ever spoke about the underground. But in 2023, at the age of 67, something shifted. Perhaps it was age. Perhaps it was the accumulation of decades of silence. Or perhaps it was something else. Something that had been waiting in the darkness all those years. Something that had followed Thomas Ashford out of that carriage and never truly left him alone. He walked into a BBC radio office in central London on a cold December morning. He asked to speak to a journalist, and he said words that had been trapped inside him since 1978. I know what happened to those 17 people. I was there, and I need to tell someone before I die, because what happened that night, it wasn't an accident, and it wasn't entirely human. Detective Inspector William Harrow first heard about the King's Cross incident on the morning of March 15th, 1978. He was sitting in his office at New Scotland Yard, nursing cold tea and reviewing files from a petty theft case, when the superintendent walked in with a folder marked Confidential, Transport Authority. Harrow was 51 years old and had spent 28 years in the Metropolitan Police. He'd seen suicides on the underground, brutal assaults, tragic accidents where maintenance workers were crushed between platforms and trains. He thought he understood the underground and its dangers, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for what the Transport Authority was describing. 17 people, gone, between 2 consecutive stations, in a sealed train car. It's impossible, Harrow said flatly, setting down his tea. Either your counters are incompetent or someone's lie about the numbers. Both, the superintendent replied. The night attendant swears the manifest was correct, but the carriage arrived at St. Paul's with only 5 passengers instead of 17. By the time it reached Bank, 3 of them had already disembarked. The other 2 never came back up. Never came back up, Harrow repeated. From where? The tunnel. That's what we're trying to figure out. The 2 surviving passengers are in shock. One of them, a woman named Patricia Hennessy, keeps repeating the same phrase. It took them down. It took them down. When we ask her what it is, she doesn't answer. She just stares. Harrow closed the file. He should have refused. He should have sent someone junior to handle what was clearly a paperwork error, a bureaucratic mess that would be forgotten within a week. But there was something in the superintendent's tone, a tremor of genuine fear, that made him stand up and reach for his jacket. I'll need access to the scene, Harrow said. The carriage, the tunnel, and I'll need to speak to the survivors. By mid-afternoon, Harrow was standing in the maintenance siding where the District Line train had been secured. The carriage was ordinary, worn blue seats, scuffed metal railings, the faint smell of diesel and human sweat that seemed to permeate every underground train. Nothing about it suggested the impossible. He walked the length of the carriage slowly. No gaps in the floor large enough for a body to fall through. No hidden compartments. No ventilation shafts that led anywhere but the roof. He examined the emergency alarm. It hadn't been pulled. The doors hadn't been forced open from inside. The passengers simply weren't there. A young Transport Authority inspector named Davies accompanied him, clearly eager to offer explanations. The manifest was definitely wrong. Davies offered. We've checked and rechecked. There's no other possibility. Someone was counting incorrectly at King's Cross. These things happen. We've implemented new procedures. No, arro interrupti guetli. Something else happened here. He could feel it, that cold, certain instinct that had developed over decades of police work. The feeling when a case didn't fit into any ordinary box. The feeling when you were standing in the presence of something that didn't make sense in a rational world. Show me where the train was in the tunnel, Harrow said, between King's Cross and St. Paul's. Show me the exact section. They took him down into the tunnels. The darkness was oppressive, held back only by the harsh beam of Davies' flashlight. The rails stretched ahead, black and wet with moisture, and the walls glistened with algae and mineral deposits. The sound of water dripping echoed through the passage, a steady, mournful rhythm that seemed to go on forever. Here, Davies said, stopping the flashlight beam on a section of wall. This is where they would have been, roughly, midway between the two stations. Harrow studied the wall. It was unremarkable, brick, painted in the institutional gray that characterized the underground, stained with decades of grime. But something caught his eye, a section of the wall that looked different from the rest. Not recent damage. Older, much older, almost as if something had scraped against it repeatedly over a long period of time. What's behind this wall? Harrow asked. Davies shrugged. Nothing. It's sealed. It's been sealed since before I started working here. I think there was an older tunnel branch that they closed off in the 1950s, but I'm not certain. Harrow pressed his hand against the wall. It was cold, damp, and underneath the damp there was something else. A vibration, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A faint rhythmic pulse that seemed to come from deep within the brick itself. He pulled his hand away. I need the records, Harrow said. Everything about this tunnel section. Construction dates, modifications, any incidents, any reports of unusual activity. And I need to speak to those 3 survivors. Patricia Hennessy was in St. Thomas Hospital, admitted under the pretense of shock and exhaustion, when Harrow entered her private room. She was sitting by the window, staring out at the London skyline, without appearing to see it. She was a woman in her mid-50s, well-dressed, the kind of person who clearly maintained routines and appearances. But her hands were shaking. Ms. Hennessy? Harrow said gently. My name is Detective Inspector Harrow. I'd like to ask you some questions about last night. She turned to look at him. Her eyes were a faded gray, and there was something broken in them. Something that suggested she'd witnessed something that had shattered whatever internal logic she used to make sense of the world. The others, she whispered. Are they here? In the hospital? No, Harrow said carefully. We're still looking for them. Patricia Hennessy made a sound, half laugh, half sob. You won't find them. You won't find them because they're not in this world anymore. What do you mean they're not in this world? She looked back out the window. When the lights went out, just for a moment, you understand, just a few seconds, I heard it. That sound. Like electrical wiring, but organic. Like something alive was made of electricity. And when the lights came back on, they were gone. All of them. The people were just gone, and the seats were empty, but... She trailed off, her jaw working soundlessly. But what? Harrow prompted. But their shadows were still there, Patricia whispered. On the seats, in the ceiling, burned into the metal, like they'd been exposed to intense heat all at once. But nobody was burned. Nobody was hurt. Just their shadows remained. Harrow felt a chill move down his spine. Did anyone else see this? The boy, Patricia said. The young man who got off at St. Paul's with me. He saw it, but he's refusing to speak. I think he's terrified. I think we both know what happened, and we're terrified. Harrow left Patricia Hennessy's hospital room and immediately began searching for the young man she'd referenced. It took 3 hours of phone calls and bureaucratic navigation, but he eventually found him. Thomas Ashford, 22 years old, construction worker, living in a hostel in Hackney. Harrow arrived at the hostel at dusk. Ashford was in a small room on the 3rd floor, sparse, barely furnished, the room of a man who kept his life minimal. When Harrow showed his credentials and entered, Thomas didn't resist. He seemed almost relieved. I knew you'd come, Thomas said. He was a lean man, with dark hair and the calloused hands of manual labor. But his eyes were hollow, the eyes of someone who hadn't slept, who wouldn't be able to sleep again for a long time. Tell me what you saw, Harrow said. Thomas sat on the edge of his bed. His hands were clasped together, so tightly his knuckles were white. I can't tell anyone, he said. I signed something, a form. They said if I talked about it, there would be consequences. Legal consequences. The Transport Authority? Harrow asked. And someone else, Thomas replied quietly. Someone who came to see me this morning. Someone from the government. I think. He didn't give a name. He just said that for everyone's safety, for national security, what happened last night could never be discussed. He said they knew where I lived. He said they knew about my family. He said it would be very unfortunate if anyone had to be reminded that the world isn't always what it seems. Harold felt his hands clench into fists. "But you're going to tell me anyway." Thomas looked at him. "Yes," he said, "because I can't carry this alone anymore. And because someone needs to know. Someone needs to document it. In case it happens again." "Tell me," Harold said, and Thomas Ashford began to speak. He described the sound, the same electrical, organic hum that Patricia Hennessy had mentioned. He described the way the lights flickered. He described how, for just a moment, he felt something in the air, a presence, a weight, a consciousness that existed outside the normal boundaries of human perception. He described looking up and seeing that the window between the carriage and the tunnel had changed. The glass was no longer reflecting the tunnel walls. Instead, it was reflecting something else, a vast darkness that seemed to extend infinitely downward, and in that darkness there were lights. Faint, pulsing lights that moved with purpose and intention. "The 17 people," Thomas said, his voice barely audible. "They didn't fall out. They went through. The glass, the metal, the walls of the carriage. They became permeable, like they were nothing but suggestions. And when the lights came back on, the 17 people had simply stepped through into somewhere else." "Where?" Harold asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "I don't know," Thomas whispered. "But before they went, they looked at me, all of them. They turned and looked directly at me, even though I was standing at the far end of the carriage. And it wasn't confused or panicked. It was like they were inviting me, like they wanted me to come with them." Harold left the hostel that night with more questions than answers. Over the following weeks, he conducted a thorough investigation. He interviewed the third survivor, a man named Malcolm Pierce, who refused to add anything to his statement beyond, "I saw the same thing," before promptly transferring to a position in Scotland where the underground didn't reach. He filed reports. He requested archival information about the sealed tunnel section. He requested geological surveys. He requested any historical documentation about underground incidents dating back to the original construction in the 1800s. And then, one by one, his requests were denied, first by the Transport Authority, then by the Home Office, then by a letter marked Official Secrets Act from a department that wasn't even listed in the government directory. On April 8, 1978, 3 weeks after the incident, Detective Inspector William Harrow was called into his superintendent's office and told that the case was closed. The official finding was that there had been a clerical error in the manifest. 17 people had never been on the train. The investigation was terminated. All files would be sealed and transferred to a secure archive. Harrow was told that if he pursued the matter further, his career would end quietly and without fanfare. The message was clear. Some mysteries were not meant to be solved. Some truths were not meant to be told. He closed the file. He never spoke about the case again during his career. But he never stopped thinking about that tunnel. Never stopped wondering what existed in that sealed section of the underground. Never stopped hearing, in his dreams, the sound that Patricia Hennessy and Thomas Ashford had described. That electrical, organic hum that suggested something vast and conscious existed in the darkness beneath London. He retired in 1994 with his silence intact. He died in 2003, taking the rest of the investigation with him into the grave. But Thomas Ashford lived on, carrying that night with him for 45 years, carrying it like a secret that burned from the inside, carrying it until 2023, when he finally decided that some truths were too important to remain buried. The BBC radio studio on Broadcasting House was quiet at 8:47 a.m. on December 12, 2023. James Mitchell, an investigative journalist who specialized in cold cases and historical mysteries, was reviewing his morning schedule when his producer walked in with a note. "Man on the line. Says he has information about a 1978 disappearance. Underground incident. Wants to go on air. Says it's urgent." Mitchell had heard similar claims before. Every cold case attracted obsessives, conspiracy theorists, people desperate to inject meaning into randomness. But there was something in his producer's expression, a genuine uncertainty, that made him pick up the call himself. Thomas Ashford, the man on the phone, said immediately. His voice was thin, weathered by age, but steady with purpose. I was there. I was on the district line on March 14th, 1978. I was one of the 3 people who survived. And I'm dying. I have weeks left, maybe a month. I need to tell someone what really happened before I'm gone. Mitchell felt something shift. This wasn't a crank. This was a man who had carried something for 45 years and couldn't carry it anymore. Come in tomorrow, Mitchell said. We'll record it. We'll put on air. Thomas Ashford arrived at the studio at 10 a.m. the next morning. He was a skeletal figure. Cancer had taken most of his weight, leaving behind a man who looked more like a photograph of himself than the man himself. But his eyes were clear. His mind was intact, and he was finally ready to speak. The recording began at 10:15 a.m. What followed was broadcast on BBC Radio 4 on the evening of December 13th, 2023, and would go viral on social media within hours. For the first time in 45 years, the story of the King's Cross 17 was being told. I was 22 years old, Thomas began, his voice steady despite the tremor of age and illness. I was going to see my girlfriend. She lived in Whitechapel. I got on at King's Cross around 11:30 p.m. I remember the train was busy, unusual for that time of night. There were 17 passengers besides me. I counted because I remember thinking how strange it was that we weren't alone. He described the journey, the fluorescent lights, the rhythm of the train on the rails, the ordinary, mundane details that make up the texture of daily life. And then he described the moment everything changed. The lights flickered, just for a second. But in that second, I felt something change in the air, like the pressure in the carriage had shifted, like we'd crossed some kind of threshold. When the lights came back on, I looked up and I saw them. The 17 people. They were standing, not sitting, standing in the middle of the carriage, facing toward the tunnel. And they were looking at something I couldn't see. What were they looking at? The journalist asked. A door, Thomas said quietly. Or at least, that's what I thought at first. But it wasn't a door in the physical sense. It was more like the wall of the carriage had become transparent. And beyond it, there was a space that shouldn't exist. A space that was vast and dark and filled with lights, pulsing lights. And the 17 people, they just walked toward it, step by step, without hesitation, without fear, like they were answering a call they'd been hearing their entire lives. And you didn't follow them? The journalist asked. Thomas was silent for a long moment. I wanted to. God help me, I wanted to. When they looked at me, and they all turned and looked at me at the same time, I felt this pull, this overwhelming pull, like gravity was suddenly oriented differently. Like if I took one more step forward, I'd be pulled into that space, and there would be no coming back. I felt the call. I heard it in my mind, not with my ears. A voice, but not a human voice. A vast voice, ancient, intelligent. It was saying my name. It was saying, Thomas, come home, come back. It's time. But you didn't go, the journalist said. No, Thomas replied, because I realized something. The voice wasn't calling to me the way it was calling to the others. It was calling to me differently. It was offering me a choice. And I understood, in that moment, why I was being offered a choice. Because I had done something. Something that connected me to whatever that was. Something that made me different from the other passengers. The journalist leaned forward. What had you done, Thomas? Thomas Ashford closed his eyes. When he opened them again, there were tears running down his weathered face. I killed someone, he said simply. 3 months before that night, March 1978. I was angry. I was young and stupid and angry. There was a man who had hurt someone I cared about, and I confronted him. We fought, and I struck him. Once. In the head. He fell. He hit his head on a corner of a table, and he died. Just like that. He died, and I panicked, and I ran. The journalist was silent, processing what he was hearing. I reported it as a robbery gone wrong. Thomas continued. The police investigated. No one was ever charged. The case went cold. But I knew what I'd done. I lived with it every single day. And on that night on the district line, that's what the voice was responding to. Not my innocence. My guilt. My sin, it was offering me a way out. It was saying, you can come with us. You can escape. You can leave this world and your guilt behind. And what did you do? The journalist asked, barely above a whisper. I refused, Thomas said. I turned my head away from that transparent wall. I closed my eyes, and I felt the pull diminish. The voice faded, and when I opened my eyes again, the 17 people were gone. The wall was solid again. Everything was normal, except I knew it would never be normal again. The authorities found you there, the journalist said, reading from the files that had been declassified in 2020. They questioned you. They let you go. They were afraid, Thomas said simply. You could see it in their eyes. They knew something impossible had happened, and they didn't know how to process it, so they chose to pretend it hadn't. They sealed the records. They told me I'd be taken care of financially if I stayed quiet. They told me there would be consequences if I didn't. But you're telling now, the journalist observed. Because I'm dying, Thomas replied, and because I need people to know the truth, not the full truth. I don't think humanity is ready for that, but the truth that there are things in this world that we don't understand, things that exist in the spaces between our perception, things that call to us. And sometimes if we listen carefully, we can hear them. What happened to the 17 people? Thomas? Do you think they're still alive somewhere? Thomas was quiet for a very long time. I don't think alive is the right word, he finally said. I think they're in a different state of existence, a different layer of reality. But yes, in some sense, I think they're still there, in that dark space with those pulsing lights. And I think they're still calling. To me, to everyone who hears this, they're calling us to come join them, to step through, to find whatever it is they found. And will you? When you die, will you step through? The journalist asked. Tovas smiled, Assad, knowing smile. Yes, he said. When my time comes, I'll go to them. Not because I want to escape my guilt, but because I've spent 45 years wondering what they found in that darkness. And now, finally, I'm ready to find out. The BBC interview was released online. Within 24 hours, it had been downloaded over 5 million times. Media outlets around the world picked up the story. Conspiracy theorists descended. Skeptics demanded evidence. Scientists offered explanations involving electromagnetic anomalies and mass hysteria. The Metropolitan Police issued a statement saying that the 1978 case remained officially closed and that Thomas Ashford's claims, while interesting, had no corroborating evidence. But something had shifted in the public consciousness. For 45 years, the King's Cross 17 had been a footnote, a sealed mystery, a story that had been deliberately forgotten. Now it was a story that couldn't be forgotten. Now it was a story that demanded answers. And in the tunnels beneath London, in the spaces between the known stations, in the darkness that no official map acknowledged, something had changed. The pull had become stronger. The calls had become more frequent. Reports began to surface online. Commuters hearing strange humming sounds on the district line. Passengers experiencing moments of missing time. People reporting inexplicable urges to step off trains between stations and walk into the tunnels. By January 2024, the Transport Authority had quietly closed a section of the district line between King's Cross and St. Paul's, citing structural concerns. The closure lasted 3 weeks. During that time, a team worked in the tunnels, though what they were doing was never publicly disclosed. When the line reopened, the mysterious humming was gone, but the urges remained. Thomas Ashford died on January 28, 2024, in a hospice in North London. His final words, according to his caregiver, were, "They're here. They're calling. It's time to go back to where it all began." The next morning, emergency services received reports of unusual activity on the district line between King's Cross and St. Paul's. When investigators arrived, they found 7 passengers who claimed to have stepped off the train to retrieve items they dropped, but no such items existed. The passengers had no memory of how they'd entered the tunnel. They had no recollection of the journey. One of them kept repeating the same phrase over and over. It was beautiful. It was so beautiful down there. Why did they make us come back? The incident was quietly documented and filed away. The Transport Authority issued another official statement denying any unusual activity. Service continued as normal. But late at night, when the trains were fewer and the tunnels were quieter, commuters still reported the same sound. That electrical, organic hum. That vast, conscious voice calling from the darkness. That ancient presence waiting in the spaces between stations, patiently inviting the living to step through and join the 17. Some mysteries, it seemed, could not be buried forever. Some truths, no matter how impossible, eventually find their way to the surface. And somewhere beneath the city streets of London, in the sealed sections of tunnel that existed outside the official maps, 17 people, or whatever remained of them, continued their eternal journey through the darkness, still calling, still waiting, still patient, still hungry,